So far this morning, and I'm really excited about our next session. So the McNair Scholars Program is in a lot of ways responsible for the existence of my department, for the legacy of a lot of the really cool undergraduate research and creative activities work that's happening across our entire campus. It is special. And so we were excited to get a chance to partner this year with Dr. Kreider and the McNair Scholars program to feature them as a special session. And so if you were with us in our first session with the impact talks, you hopefully noticed that there were 3-minute talks that moved relatively quickly between presenters. Because of the time limit, they didn't get to go into a lot of detail. This session is going to take a more traditional academic talk format, and so we'll have 3 presenters in the hour, and those students will have longer to go into their work. But I believe we still got some time planned for questions. I've already said way too much, so I'm going to hand things off to Dr. Kreider and let him introduce his students.
So the microphones are for Zoom, so that's why you're not hearing it in the room. So we'll make sure the students project. But I'm Dr. John Kreider. I'm the director of the McNair Scholars Program. For those that aren't aware, McNair Scholars Program, it's a TRIO grant to the Department of Education. We work with students that are interested in doing research, but also going into graduate school, particularly the PhD track. So these 3 students that we are having present have been starting to work on, continuing to work on, and I think we have one that's somewhat finished in presenting from a variety of different fields and backgrounds. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time to introduce each of them now, because each of them will have an introductory slide and you'll get to know them through their own research. So I will turn the time over to Kalaya for our first presentation.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Kalaya Hicks, and I'm a senior at Texas Tech University, majoring in computer engineering. And the research that I will be talking about today is building the soft skills of new engineers, a qualitative study of engineering students' soft skills. So how did I come about this topic? In engineering, we have to, for computer and electrical engineers, we have to take project lab classes. And it goes up to project lab 5, but it can get credited for an elective. So in my first project lab class, I realized that when people began to present and we had to write papers, and when it came to group conflict, everyone was very uncomfortable. They didn't know how to talk in front of a crowd. They didn't see the relevance of writing papers and explaining your technical skills on the project that you're talking about, and didn't just know how to go about handling group conflict. So this made me very curious and brought me upon my research. So my research topic is to investigate the soft skills of engineers, including writing, presentation, conflict resolution, and creativity skills. So for my research questions, my main research question is, what do potential new engineers think about the effects of writing, presentation, conflict resolution, and creativity skills? This was the main question that I wanted to answer through my research. However, there were some other questions that I also wanted to answer. And so this brings me to my sub-questions, and they are, what do potential new engineers think about why soft skills are beneficial for an engineer's career or not? Why do some engineers struggle more with soft skills than others? And what can be done to improve engineers' soft skills to prepare them for their work in the industry? So this brings me to my literature review. So as I was reading upon articles for my research, one way to train soft skills was through a person-centered approach that is similar to how companies train their managers. Another approach for training engineer soft skills was through the viewpoint of potential employees. And the last one that I found, this article focused specifically on given skills such as communication, presentation, and communication within a team, both domestically and internationally, along with writing. However, I found through these articles that none of the articles provided data for the perspective of engineering students. And this is where I will be filling the gap with my research. So for my methodology for my research, I will be doing a qualitative study, and I will be digitally recording the interviews. Interviews will last about 15 to 20 minutes, and I will have 12 questions that I'll be asking the people that I'll be interviewing. And the participants that I'm focusing on are specifically junior and senior engineers. And I would like to have 2 students from each department of engineering. And there are 7 engineering departments here at Texas Tech University. And there's roughly about 11 types. of engineerings because some engineerings coincide with each other, for instance, like environmental and civil. And I would like to have an even ratio of men and women. And as for my recruitment, I will be reaching out to the advising staff at the Engineering Center. So at Tech, the Engineering Center is used for like when we have job fair and other things. So they reach out to all the engineering departments. So some questions that I'll be asking during the interview process is, what do you as a potential new engineer think can be done to improve engineers' writing, presentation, conflict resolution, and creativity skills to prepare them for their work in the industry? Another question that I will be asking is, how much writing, presentation, conflict resolution, or creativity skills is required in your major? I asked this question to see if there was a balance or imbalance present in across all the engineering degrees. So how we'll be going about this methodology is the GEO method. So there's first order concepts. So when I transcribe the data that I will collect through the digitally recorded interviews, I will have all the first order concepts that I get from the interviews. Then from there, we could cluster them into the second order themes. And after the themes, we get the overall theme that you see from the interviews presented. So the main goal for my research is to have someone, if not myself, develop a new training approach to build engineers' soft skills to better prepare them for their career in the industry. But how do I go about reaching this goal? First, I will provide engineering students perspectives on soft skills because I believe that is very important. And from there, I will have to determine how much writing, presentation, and conflict resolution is desired in each department. And after I know how much of these soft skills are desired, I can provide a student-generated solution to this problem. So the software that I'm using for this research is MaxQDA and Vivo. So these two softwares identify keywords or phrases, and it also helps with identifying first and second order themes within the results. So for recruitment, I have this lovely flyer right here that I'll be using for when I send out emails either through Tech Announce, the Engineering Center, and when I put them, oh, I'm so sorry. This flyer around campus, I'll be using this flyer for recruitment. So what are my next steps? Currently, I am waiting for the Engineering Center to get back to me about approving the flyer that I have so they can email it out to everyone. And I also have to wait to reach out to people through Tech Announce and the specific buildings on campus for me to hang up flyers. So if the people at the Engineering Center do not get back to me about, hey, we will actually let you we will send out this email, then I plan on going to all the advisors in the engineering key to talk to them to see if they could also put out the flyers to see if anyone is interested. And a goal that me and my mentor have is to have the interviews recorded before Thanksgiving. So after Thanksgiving, I'll be able to transcribe and perform the data analysis that needs to be done. And I also, as I'm waiting for me to get interviews, I'll be familiarizing myself with the data software that I'll be using, and then I can write up the results. So here are my references. And I would like to thank my mentor, Dr. Mitchell, for helping me oh so very much, and Dr. Kreider, and now Dr. Trish for assisting me through everything and helping me with my research. Thank you.
Open it up to some discussions. And then, yeah, Tina, if you want to come and start setting up yours, to any questions that people might have online or in the room.
Yes.
I think you have,
That's for Zoom, so that's why you
okay. I'll make sure I project, but I'm really excited about your research. I think it's definitely an untapped area. And I'm really curious to kind of probe one of your sub-research questions because you are asking what might, maybe potentially what factors might contribute to some engineering students having these soft skills that can be really beneficial for their work and some who may not have those skills. So do you have any ideas of what factors might contribute to that? Maybe male versus female students or the type of engineering program or any other factors you've thought about?
Yes, so what I have realized going through my project lab classes is why some people don't have these soft skills is because they get anxiety a lot when it comes to presenting, or they just, at least for writing, a lot of engineers don't see the significance of writing. It's like, why do I have to write? Well, if you invent something, you need to explain how you made it and if any error occurred so people can like backtrack your process. Another thing that I have realized upon males is that they have a very hard time putting their pride aside when it comes to presenting, because in my classes, they'll sit and explain something that they don't know what's happening, and the professor will continue to ask questions. Well, what about this? And instead of saying, I don't know, which is an appropriate answer, it's fine to say you don't know because you don't have to know everything. They'll try to reiterate what they already said, and it just gets very confusing. It's like, well, you actually don't know what you're talking about, so you could just say, I don't know. It's an okay answer.
Other questions? I don't know if we have any online, or I have a question. If we don't, I can definitely work on that. Yeah, over here.
So I know a lot of this has to deal with like engineering as a whole is like a STEM major, and that revolves around like being higher in academia, feeling like you're smarter. Do you think that maybe like that contributes to that as well? Feeling like, oh, my emotions and expressing myself and kind of like doing these sorts of things is really below me. I should be better than this. Like, do you feel like it's ingrained in the system of engineering itself? And how do you feel like maybe we can change that?
I have actually never thought about it that way. I believe the answer to that question is yes. But another thing that I've realized is that a lot of people come in already knowing a lot of things, so they find it irrelevant even learning. But I'm like, if you already knew everything, you would just be out in industry, not here continuing to learn. Whereas other people come in with not any knowledge whatsoever, and it seems as though those people are more willing to learn and express themselves better than the other individuals who already deem that they know everything. Did that answer your question? Okay.
I know you haven't touched on it yet, but I was just wondering, how are you going to be able to standardize soft skill sets when you start doing data analysis?
Outstanding question. I really do not know how to answer that. Can you repeat it one more time?
So, like, when I think of soft skills, I kind of think it as a subjective experience and very individualized. So I was just wondering, when you go to data analysis, how are you going to be able to kind of create a standard of soft skills to compare? If that makes sense.
Yes.
Just to clarify, I need to make sure I'm understanding. I think he's looking for like, how are you going to categorize the soft skills? Are you looking at specific ones? Is that what it is? Like the different categories of soft skills, which I think you had on one of your slides.
Yeah,
like
I'm
writing,
sorry. That was kind of loud.
all those different things. Yeah.
The soft skills that I'm focusing on are writing, presentation, conflict resolution, and creativity skills. So those are the ones that I'm focusing on.
And so my question is you're working with Dr. Ron Mitchell, who is in Rawls in communication and leadership and other things he does. And what led you to choose him to be your mentor for this project?
Outstanding question. I realized I was really struggling to pick a research topic when it came to being a McNair Scholar, because originally I thought for one of my old mentors, I was like, oh, we worked with RF analog and all those things, but I really didn't like the lab. And I was like, well, I love engineering, but certain aspects of engineering or the labs present at TTU really weren't geared towards my interests. And I'm really interested in leadership and innovation. And Dr. Dallas exposed me to innovation by us going to Red Raider Startup and doing things of that nature. And then you and Ms. Trish, Dr. Trish, recommended me to look at Dr. Mitchell, who is in the business program. So that was a very helpful step to make, and I'm very thankful that I met up with him.
Great, thank you, Kalaya. Let's give Kalaya a round of applause for her. Okay. I want to just switch out the mic for Tina. So while Tina's getting set up, I'd like to introduce our next presenter, Tina Greene. She's working in a number of labs this semester, and so she'll be presenting on one of the projects that she's been working on as soon as we get the technology figured out. So I'll turn it over to her whenever she's ready and set up. So.
All right, hi everybody. My name is Tina Greene. I'm a psychology undergraduate student here at Texas Tech University, and I'm representing, of course, the McNair Scholars Program, but also the PATS Lab under the advisement of Dr. Paul Ingram. And today I'm going to be talking to you about using the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory 3, or the MMPI-3 for short, to assess individuals with post-traumatic stress disorder using a clinical interview. So starting with a brief overview, I'm going to walk you through the introduction, our literature review. We'll go through our research question, our methods, some preliminary results, and then the next steps. So 50 to 70% of Americans experience at least one potentially traumatic event in their lifetime, which is an event that is emotionally distressing that's either experienced or witnessed firsthand. Some examples of trauma are active combat, abuse, physical injury, natural disasters, physical and sexual assault. In trauma, it can produce profound negative effects such as post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. This is a mental health condition that arises from experiencing said trauma, and there are 4 PTSD symptom categories, which are intrusive memories, avoidance, negative changes to thinking and mood, and arousal symptoms as well. So approximately 12 million people in the United States are diagnosed each year with PTSD, and that leads to increased healthcare utilization, 5 times the rate of attempted and completed suicide. We're seeing difficulties with individuals with PTSD maintaining jobs and social relationships. We're seeing more comorbid conditions with individuals with PTSD, such as substance use disorder, for example. And overall, individuals with PTSD are experiencing lower lifespans compared to individuals without. Which brings us to 2 high-risk groups, college students and veterans. They both have the similar risk factors when it comes to PTSD. We're seeing individuals of lower socioeconomic status or women specifically experiencing higher rates of PTSD. Especially for veterans, women experience higher rates of military sexual trauma, so we're seeing higher rates of PTSD with that too. And also, college students tend to underdisclose their trauma, so we're seeing less PTSD diagnoses because of that as well. Which brings us to the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the MMPI. What is it? It's a psychological or personality assessment that was created in 1943. It is been shown to have moderate relationships in past versions to assess trauma. Specifically, the MMPI-2-RF, the restructured form, has the AXY or anxiety scale, which is the central scale in assessing trauma within the MMPI. Which brings us to the most recent version, MMPI-3. It was created in 2020, and it contains 335 items. Its primary goals for this revision were to update the test norms to reflect the census. They wanted to expand the item pool in revised scales, so that anxiety scale that we were seeing before became the anxiety-related experiences, or ARX scale, which is a 15-item measure, and it's also seen to be the central scale in the MMPI-3 for assessing trauma. Which brings us to our research question. The broad impact of all of this so far is we want to evaluate the diagnostic utility of the MMPI for PTSD. So we're asking, how effectively does the ARX scale within the MMPI-3 identify and classify those with PTSD? So starting with our general recruitment, we had students who signed up through the psychology's department's research participation system, or SONA. They signed up for course credit, and we had During initial analyses, we had 11 students come in with around a mean age around 18 and a half years old. They came in, they filled out some surveys. Within the first survey, there was the life events checklist, which assesses criterion A for PTSD, which that means that we're trying to assess if someone has experienced a potentially traumatic event. And 73% of those individuals did meet criterion A, with 45% of those experiencing a physical assault and 18% of those experiencing sexual assault. Currently, 1 out of those 11 individuals have met diagnostic criteria for PTSD. As I said, they did come in and complete some surveys. The first Qualtrics surveys had the life events checklist along with the PCL-5, which is a self-report measure to assess PTSD symptoms, along with other measures such as anxiety, depression, mental health attitude scales, things like that. After they finished that, they completed the MMPI-3 to assess its diagnostic utility. And then lastly, after doing that, we took them into our interview room with me and another grad student to complete the CAPS-5, which is a clinical interview to determine an official PTSD diagnosis. And the CAPS-5 is considered the gold standard in the industry for diagnosing PTSD. Preliminary results are showing large positive relationships between the internalization scales within the MMPI-3 scales with both the PCL-5 and the CAPS-5. And correlations between the ARX and the CAPS-5 with PTSD symptom clusters were moderate in effect size. So far with looking at its diagnostic utility, this is a very good sign. Our next steps, currently we have 17 students from the general recruitment who have completed it. So far, we're looking to get about 50 individuals who do not have a PTSD as a compare group, but also now we have a mass survey that went out to freshman students in the beginning of the semester, and the PCL-5 was within the mass survey, so we're looking at students who were above threshold for potential PTSD to recruit them to come in so that we can assess more individuals who may have PTSD. Of the 1,087 students who completed the mass survey, 21% meet the requirements for specialized recruitment. So we're reaching out to 5 to 10 of those individuals a week to get them scheduled for the following week. So far, we have 2 individuals scheduled right now. And then recently, it's really exciting. We have funding secured through TRU and the Texas Tech Psychology Department to recruit a separate veteran group, which right now we're going through the process for the IRB modification, as well as creating all of the recruitment materials and things like that. And that should start in January of 2023. Right now, there's a plan. I've submitted my abstract to present the findings at the SPA conference in Austin. And other than that, I did want to say that assessment is very important. Not only, assessment's very important, but assessing the diagnostic utility of this measure is not only important for the measure itself, but for individuals who have experienced trauma in order to get them proper assessment to lead to a diagnosis. So what we're doing makes an impact. Here are my references, and then I want to say a big thank you to the McNair Scholars Program, Dr. Kreider, and newly doctor as of yesterday, Trish Phillips. I want to give her a round of applause for that because that's amazing. And then I want to thank my mentor, Dr. Ingram, and my co-authors, Ashlyn, who's right here, and Megan, who couldn't be here today, the TRU Symposium for letting us present, and Texas Tech. If you have any questions that can't be answered, my contact information is on the screen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tina. Okay, so questions for Tina.
So since assessment is very important, just like you said, how are you getting people to actually get assessed? Since I believe that there's a lot of individuals with PTSD that almost are sheltered with it, and if they want to keep it to themselves, how are you getting those individuals inside your clinic?
I mean, I'm currently an undergraduate student, so I don't have a clinic opportunity, but what makes me think is that MMPI-3 is for a variety of measures, so you don't have to be specifically coming in for trauma-related experiences to get assessed. If you come in and have a general assessment, this is a tool that's going to put up a red flag and then see that there has been some related experiences, which will help lead to a further diagnosis.
Other questions?
Awesome presentation, Tina.
Thank you.
Really excited to hear more about the work that you're involved in. I was pretty concerned with the fact that 21% of the students that took that, the string of surveys on SONA meet that specialized criteria. Do you know if that percentage is representative of college students at other universities, or is this just a surprising figure that we haven't really tapped into yet?
I'd say it's close. The range is like from research that I've seen in the literature review kind of ranges from like 5 to 30% depending on the college. So it is representative, but I also think that speaks to how it is still important to do research on college students because they are having trauma experiences, especially because you don't know if they're coming into college with prior experiences, but there's also high risk in entering college and having those experiences happen too, which we are seeing.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
All right, fine. Other questions? Oh, these chairs are loud, sorry. So I have like 2 questions, Tina.
Okay.
Of course I do, right?
Yes.
One is, how do you think COVID is playing into some of the numbers and some of the responses you're seeing in these assessments? Because a lot of these 18-year-olds have spent the last 2 years dealing with a lot of stuff with online schooling and possibly death in their own families, which obviously leads to different variations of trauma. But how do you think COVID is affecting the numbers you're seeing?
I mean, yeah, of course, there has been a mass amounts of death or complete life changes, but I also think these high school students at the time or any age being ripped out of their life in school and thrown into a completely new environment could be considered a potentially traumatic event themselves. It just depends how the individual reacts to it. So I feel like that's something that could have further research on regarding assessment too. Thank you. Does that answer your question? Okay, cool.
And then my other question is dealing with race. Like you didn't really talk about that in your presentation, but I know like certain cultures tend to disregard getting treatment or even getting assessed. And how are you taking that into a fact of maybe those who are showing up possibly skewing your data toward one, maybe being more heavily toward one cultural group versus another, or are you doing something else to kind of watch for that?
That's a great question and something that we should definitely take into account in our lab. I don't know the answer to that right now, but it's something that I'll want to think about and see what we can do to make some changes.
Fair enough. Great
Thank
answer.
you.
That's a good example of how to answer a question when you're like, I don't know, but I will figure it out.
If you want to speak on it,
I'm
you're
sure
welcome
Dr.
to.
Ingram, her advisor, probably has a formulation of an answer to that. But other questions?
So kind of a follow-up, but along those same lines, do you feel like most people, or do all individuals who experience one of the traumatic events that was on your slide, are they automatically diagnosed with PTSD?
No, you'd be surprised how resilient people can be. I was actually surprised during the initial run of participants to see how many people have experienced pretty significant trauma and had very adaptive responses to it. But that doesn't mean that we don't need to ignore people who are experiencing it, though.
Any questions online? Dr. Trish? I have one more question. So once someone is diagnosed through your lab, what's the protocol for helping them to get more professional services to make sure that we're not just learning how to diagnose them better, but also make sure they get the treatment that they needed?
Of course, we're providing them with a list of mental health resources, both on campus, local, and national, to hopefully help them guide. We can't force them to use it, but hopefully they will choose to.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Tina. Let's give her a round of applause for
Thank
her
you
hard
for your
work.
question.
And to give props to Tina, she has both of her advisors, Dr. Rogers and Dr. Ingram, in the audience. So those, it's a lot of pressure when you're presenting in front of the people that you're working for. Our next presenter will be Elijah. And Elijah did this research this past summer for an SROP, which is a summer research opportunity program through Purdue University. And so he had an opportunity to spend, what, 8 weeks, Elijah?
Yes.
8 weeks in Indiana, experiencing research at a different lab in a different. Indiana's very different than West Texas, and so he got to experience, and plus work with a lot of different students and faculty from across the country. So we'll give Elijah his time.
All right. Hi, everybody. So right now, I'm currently in the stage of completing PhD applications for clinical psychology. So as Dr. Kreider was saying, I did research with colorblind racial ideology by political orientation, gender, and ethnicity this summer with the SROP program. I did this with Dr. David Rawlock at Purdue University and Adeline Osnaya, which was his grad student. So the first thing that I wanted to touch on is what is colorblind racial ideology? So colorblind racial ideology is, in a sense, the ideology that everybody is the same, regardless of ethnicity. Pretty much every ethnicity, we're all the same, no matter what. When it comes to how the system works, there's no disconnect in a sense. It's the ideology that a lot of us grew up, in a sense, the education system tried to tell us that as long as we see everybody the same, that's the best way to handle racism. Sadly enough, research has shown that this type of ideology has actually influenced racial prejudice because it ignores a really big detail, and that big detail is systematic differences. So pretty much differences when it comes to how organizations, how the political system, and how the education system is set. So it's pretty much in the sense, if you look at all race, all different ethnicities the same, but some ethnicities or some racial backgrounds have more barriers than another, then you're not giving it the correct, in a sense, baseline for being able to judge certain things. It's kind of like asking two people to run a race, but putting hurdles in front of one person and keeping the race nice and clear for the other person, and expecting both of them to get to the same spot. So it's that type of deal there. Another thing that we wanted to look at is how conservative and liberal ideology worked when it came to colorblind racial ideology. One of the big things that I saw from prior literature is kind of one of the big beliefs that colorblind racial ideology holds is that if you believe in colorblind racial ideology, you believe that hard work will get you to a certain spot regardless of barriers. That's kind of a belief that kind of goes in line with conservative ideology, as it is very traditional in the sense that hard work will get you to a certain aspect of things. So I wanted to be able to compare conservative ideology specifically, as well as everything from extreme conservative to extreme liberal in comparison with colorblind racial ideology. We had also seen that gender has an influence. So prior literature had said that men tend to have higher colorblind racial ideology. And then we wanted to be able to look at the differences within ethnicity and race and how these affect as well the colorblind racial ideology. So here are some of the hypotheses that we came up with this summer. So we actually have 5. So individuals who identify as more conservative will report higher levels of CBRI than more liberal participants, kind of going off of that hard work traditional ideal. We thought that that would correlate well with colorblind racial ideology. Also, individuals who identify as white will report higher levels of CBRI compared to Hispanic and African Americans. African Americans will report less or equal levels of CBRI compared to Hispanics, and men will report the higher levels of CBRI than women. So one big thing to note, the reason why we had these type of hypotheses is because groups that tend to be, how would you say, when it comes to the system, have a little bit more barriers when it comes to education system, political system, these different ethnicities and races that have a little bit more barriers, we believe that they would end up not wanting to adopt colorblind racial ideology because it's not beneficial to their own group. So whereas for another group where this type of ideology benefits you in a sense, in a sense, the white group, we would assume you'd want to keep this ideology. So that's kind of where we were going with these hypotheses. I also have right here, so political orientation, ethnicity, race will interact with the COBRA scores, which is the colorblind racial ideology scores. Hispanic would score less than black when liberal. Hispanic would score less than black when conservative. White would score less than Hispanic when liberal. White less than Hispanic when moderately conservative. And then black would always then Hispanic, and then white when moderately conservative. And one of the things we also wanted to be able to really pinpoint is when you look at the three-way interaction between political orientation, colorblind racial ideology scores, gender, and ethnicity, that we would be able to say white extremely conservative men will report the highest CBRI scores, while African-American liberal women would score the lowest in CBRI. So we also added an exploratory analysis, and we did that with an Asian population. There wasn't a lot of literature when it came to, in a sense, how the Asian ethnicity/racial group, what their tendencies were when it came to colorblind racial ideology. So we left this as an exploratory analysis that we were able to explore with our tests. So for our methods, we ended up, we got self-reported surveys from a research pool at a Midwest university. So what we did is we gave them a self-report Qualtrics survey. So the demographics, they just had to report their ethnicity and their gender. And we stayed specifically with man, woman, and then ethnicity we used Hispanic, Black, Asian, and white as our groups. So right here are the totals. We had 3,564 total participants, and there is your breakdown right there of how many were in each ethnicity group. So another thing, so how we were able to measure the colorblind racial ideology. So this was a test that was actually created by Neville in 2000. So it pretty much has two parts to it. One part is how strongly do you believe the system is fair, and how strongly do you believe that race doesn't have an impact on how we perform. So those are the two parts to this colorblind racial ideology scale. And then I also wanted to look at political orientation measures. So I went from extremely liberal to extremely conservative, so extremely, moderately, neither, and then thus forth. So for the results, so we were able to complete this experiment this summer. So we got results and everything like that. So one of the first things that we were able to find for our first hypothesis is conservative participants scored significantly higher CBRI scores. So this is what we were expecting to find. What we did for these results is we did analysis of variance. So that's how we were able to compare these things. All the results that you're going to see are statistically significant results as well. So here pretty much you can see how these scores were able to, how these scores ended up coming out when it came from extremely liberal to extremely conservative, the higher your CBRI score. So remember, the higher your CBRI score is the more that you think that there's no effect when it comes to how the system works, and that there's no effect when it comes to race. So we found some results that we were expecting on this front. For our hypothesis 2, we found that white and Asian participants reported significantly higher levels of CBRI compared to Latinx and African Americans. This was something that we also expected as we were talking about the groups that possibly have less systematic barriers would probably want to adopt an ideology such as colorblind racial ideology, whereas groups that have a little bit more systematic barriers would probably not want to. Thus, we are believing that that could be one of the mechanisms that are causing the differences on why certain ethnicities, in a sense, adopted this colorblind racial ideology belief. So here are the results with this. One that I think was really surprising was I didn't really know how the Asian group was going to come out when it came to this study, and they scored very similarly to the white group. The major difference, though, is with the white group, the more liberal you were. So if you were extremely liberal and white, your scores were very low with CBRI. But if you were extremely conservative and white, your scores were really high. When it came to the Asian group, they started a lot higher on CBRI scores when liberal than white, but then they didn't go to the extreme when extremely conservative on high CBRI scores, which I thought was pretty fascinating. They kind of stayed more towards the mean of scores, whereas Black and Latinx were much lower on that sense of things. For hypothesis 3, men reported higher levels of CBRI than women. This is something that we expected based off prior literature. There's quite a big difference when it comes to this statistic right here. So yes, there's our graph of male and female with colorblind racial ideology scores. So this one, the political orientation, ethnicity interacted with CBRI such that, so Hispanic was less than Black when liberal, Hispanic was about equal to Black when moderately conservative, white was about equal to Hispanic when liberal, and white was greater than Hispanic when moderately conservative. So Black was always the lowest in CBRI, but Black was similar to Hispanic and less than white when moderately conservative. So we'll be able to see, this is when we did our ANOVA to be able to check these different things out. So right here, we're looking at colorblind racial ideology by ethnicity and political orientation. So how these interact together. So this was also a significant effect. So we were able to see, in a sense, if you're, based on your ethnicity and your political orientation, we were better able to see where your means would possibly be on that sense of things. So the next hypothesis, white extremely conservative men reported highest CBRI scores, while Black extremely liberal women reported the lowest CBRI scores. So this is what we expected to see. We were actually able to find that the highest means when it came to CBRI was actually, as we predicted, white conservative men, and the lowest was Black extremely liberal women. So here this is also another significant results here. So this is when we did the three-way interaction between everything. So we were able to do gender, ethnicity, political orientation, and colorblind racial ideology, which had a significant effect to be able to understand which groups were going to score which way when it came to colorblind racial ideology. So for the exploratory analysis, the Asian American group had scored significantly higher CBRI scores than both Black and Hispanic participants, but Asian scores consistently higher in CBRI scores, but did not reach the extreme high in ranges of the white participants, as I was saying earlier with the Asian study. So why is this so important? So colorblind racial ideology is really important to study because by being able to look at this ideology, we're better able to see what kind of problems it can cause depending if you adopt this type of ideology, depending on your ethnicity. So one of the big things is you can see that Hispanic and Black aren't really adopting this, this ideology, especially when liberal. But the ones that do accept this ideology when conservative, when they're ignoring, in a sense, the systematic barriers that possibly are out there, it can cause, it's given reason to believe that it can be a cause for pretty much a thing called internalized racism. So it can lead to things where necessarily you don't believe you're enough, in a sense, because you're like, why am I not getting to the same place as somebody else with the same amount of work? And you start seeing it as something within yourself versus systematic barriers. This is a really important thing to be able to study. And since we are able to see the one-way interactions, the two-way interactions, and the three-way interactions with the 5x4 factorial ANOVA, we're able to see that these things are, in a sense, demonstrated the way that we believe so. So based off of that, we can actually have a better idea of, okay, who probably has these ideologies with the colorblind racial ideology, and who could possibly be more at risk for depression and anxiety based on your ideology of colorblind racial ideology. So by looking at gender, political orientation, ethnicity, and your CBRI scores, we might have a better idea on how to be able to find those people who may be struggling. So this will be able to lead to something further on when it comes to those things. So thank you, everybody. I wanted to thank Dr. John Kreider. I wanted to thank Dr. Phillips now, yes. Dr. David Rawlock at Purdue University, our OP program, the McNair Scholars program. And thank you all for showing up today and checking out our research speeches. So thank you.
Okay, questions for Elijah?
So, wow, first of all, this is incredible work. It's
Thank
really
you.
important work. Obviously, this is a huge systemic issue. So I was wondering, now that you have all of this, like, what's your next move? Obviously, this is a huge deal. This really needs to be dealt with. So, like, what do you feel like is the future direction for you, or like could be built off of this?
Well, now that we're able to see, in a sense, how these means are reacting with these different populations, these different groups, We want to be able now to check the connection between colorblind racial ideology and depression and anxiety. Because now if we can find that correlation, that connection, that's going to be significant in being able to predict between who's most at risk for depression, anxiety, and what could be the factors and mechanisms that are causing these things to happen. So it's going to be a good predictor tool. It needs some more research passed on to be able to figure out the actual mental health outcomes that CBRI can cause. But that would be the next steps, is to be able to see that and then later on be able to predict who might be suffering from depression and anxiety.
I look forward to more of your work.
Thank you.
I'll steal this next. That was a great talk
Thank you.
and great work. When you're looking at gender and ethnicity, your findings are pretty consistent with the perspective that intersectional minoritized individuals and those minoritized identities kind of predict social liberalism and this kind of push for inclusion, operationalized here as a focus on colorblind ideology. You talked about gender as male and female, and you talked about ethnicity as white, black, just kind of these categorical definitions. How do you think that your results would change or differ if you moved into gender roles and gender identity versus sort of like your representation of biological sex? And as a similar proxy to that, acculturation rather than surface level trait like black, white, how do you think would be different?
I think it would change quite drastically, honestly. Even so, in one of the labs that I'm in, I work with Dr. Brandy Watson in the Latinx Resiliency Lab, and it was hard to be able to group the groups into 4 groups because, Dr. Rolaketi actually did a study previously that looked at East, South, Asia. He looked at the different types of Asian groups, and each one actually had distinct differences. With this one, though, it was such a large pool, and with the timing and all that, we decided to put it all into 4 groups to give us a general idea of necessarily where these groups are leaning towards. And the nice thing about this is it leads to more availability for research to be able to look distinctly into those groups. That could be another thing to be able to predict who has certain ideologies, who might be struggling from depression, those type of things, who might be struggling from internalized racism. So it might be a great way to actually be more specific on who we can actually be able to deal with. So this was kind of the big one in a sense, and then from there on we'll be able to hopefully do some more research that will be able to look into specific groups depending on ethnicity and race. Thank you, appreciate it.
Excellent. Other questions? Oh, I'm a fellow McNair scholar.
Okay, my question pertains to the Asian results that you got.
Yes.
What are you going to do with that information since there's not a lot of study out there? And also, do you think the results pertain to the Asian countries being more homogenistic?
One of the cool things that I saw in the literature before we actually decided to do this result is that there was this concept called the model minority, which the Asian group usually gets placed into. So it's this group, pretty much how the minority group does within the systematic, within the United States, that can play a big role onto how they react with these certain ideologies. So it's pretty much, if it benefits you as a group, you're most likely going to be adopting such an ideology. And since when it comes to education, systematic barriers, they kind of lean a little bit more towards white versus the minority groups of Black and Hispanic. We expected them to be a little bit higher, but we did not expect them to be as close to the white population that we were able to see. But when you looked into the statistics a little bit deeper, they didn't hit the extremes on either end. So it kind of seems like they're kind of in this middle ground when it comes to colorblind racial ideology, when it comes to these things, which I thought was really fascinating. It's something I want to look at more to figure out why this ethnicity, and specifically when we can actually look at the different groups within the Asian population, how they react when it comes to colorblind racial ideology.
So one question that I had was, I saw that your data was divided into 4 groups, and one group had 1,000 people in it, and the other group had 100.
Mm-hmm.
How does that affect your hypothesis and graph? Like, does it skew your data?
Luckily, there was a much larger white population when it came to that. It's because where the study was conducted, it was a Midwestern university. So over there, it tends to be it was a PWI. So it's much easier to get a lot more white participants. That's one of the struggles of getting results when it comes to Midwestern universities. But luckily, we had a large enough pool when it came to each ethnicity that we were able to still get significant results. So all of the results that I showed up here, they were statistically significant by a p-level of 0.05. So it can skew the results a little bit, but when you have significant results, those actually play into what they're saying that they are. So there's no extra pool or anything like that. So yes.
Well, building on her question, I assume the class that this was given in was probably the introductory psychology course.
Correct, yes.
So a lot of these are freshman students, first year students.
Correct.
So how much did age, do you think, played a factor in the numbers? And would this change, say, if you were to look at like the 30 plus age group or the 50 plus age group?
I think it definitely would change. It would have been nice to be able to look at how age as well affected colorblind racial ideology. From the literature that I was able to see, there wasn't too much of an effect. I think it was more so, that's more so why I went with the political orientation, because that seemed to have the bigger effect on being able to sway from one end to the other. But I feel like if we did go with an older age group, we could end up seeing, as people even switch their political orientation sometimes as they get older as well. So it's something that definitely could be looked into, and I think that would change the results as well. It tends to be, there's more liberal when it comes to psychology, general class. As a PWI, we were able to get a pretty even split between liberal and conservative group, which was really nice for being able to get the results that we did. So yeah, I would like to go check the different age groups though, see if that has any effect. I would assume it would have a little bit of an effect, but I don't think anything too crazy where it could completely skew the results.
Fair enough. Other questions? Yes.
Just to get your opinion on things, do you think that this needs to be more talked about in education more so? I believe like in college level age groups than adults, because I believe the older you get, like the harder it is to change your mind on certain things. But do you believe that future generations will have the opportunity to make that impact?
I think it's extremely important that we become more educated on this, because at least for my generation, from where I grew up, this was the ideology that I grew up believing. Everybody's the same regardless of race and ethnicity. And as I've been able to see through the research, this can be a very bad thing to have, especially necessarily for myself, but then also for other people when it comes to interactions depending on different race and ethnicity. One of the big things too is finding what type of ideology would be able to, in a sense, take away these initial prejudice. Because since colorblind racial ideology kind of enforces this type of prejudice, what type of ideology then is the right one to be teaching our kids to try and get rid of these initial prejudices that we have as we grow up? So this is kind of a start to finding out that maybe this isn't the best way to go. What direction can we look at next to be able to help the next generation to be able to fix these things when it comes to racism, stereotypes, all those type of things.
So you talked about systematic barriers in these institutions for people of color, and I want to know if you compared success rates for people of color in the white majority group.
Success rates in what sense?
As in people of color who have been attending colleges and white people who have attended colleges and people who have turned their studies into careers, comparing like the white majority group and the people of color.
So we didn't compare like these success rates between the groups, but one thing that we were able to see when it comes to the results that we got is the advantaged groups can look at those minority people that do succeed even out of those systematic barriers. They can use that as a way to enforce their prejudiced views. Because say you have a group of people that have to get through more barriers and one makes it through. You can look at that and say, see, you can make it through no matter what the barriers are, in a sense, kind of using that as an excuse to say that these other people just didn't work hard enough, when there might be more barriers between that which are being ignored. So it does have that effect of being able to, how would you say, it enforces the prejudice beliefs by when you see a minority person or somebody who is coming from a systematically disadvantaged group, when you see one that comes and succeeds, it actually can allow for more prejudice, because it gives you kind of that excuse to be like, okay, one made it, everyone can make it, even though that's not necessarily the case. It could be one of those diamond in the rough type of cases. Whereas if you took away the systematic barriers, you'd have a lot more coming out of that minority group, in a sense. So we didn't necessarily look at the success rates, in a sense, which would be interesting to see between those groups, how those played a part. But we can kind of predict, in a sense, not necessarily predict, but see which groups are actually succeeding and why there are differences and who's succeeding in these groups.
Okay, other questions for Elijah? I think we're out of time, so thank you very much, Elijah.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank everyone for coming to the McNair Scholar Forum. If you're interested in the McNair Scholars Program, we are recruiting those who will be graduating in spring of 2025, which sounds crazy, like that we're looking at. But if you're basically a sophomore this year or a junior with a couple of years left, we'll open applications in January. But please come talk to myself or Dr. Phillips or one of the scholars that are here today and that'll be here throughout the whole weekend. We'd be more than happy to talk with you.